Welcome to this episode of Wesleyan Ways, exploring our Methodist roots. I'm Reverend Alan Combs, the pastor of First United Methodist Church in Salem, Virginia. Today we have joining us as our guest Reverend Dr. Lacey Warner, who is the professor of the practice of church ministry and Methodist studies, as well as associate dean for Wesleyan engagement at Duke University Divinity School. Welcome, Dr. Warner.
Thank you. Great to be here.
Good. And of course, we're also joined by Bishop Sue Hopper Johnson in our conversation as well.
Great. Glad to be here.
Good. Well, getting started, today our topic to discuss is connectionalism. And so as kind of sort of an opening question, I know this is probably going to feel kind of like a Board of Ordained Ministry question, Dr. Warner, but how would you describe connectionalism, like say to like a confirmation class?
Oh, excellent question. And it's been a few years since I've been before the board. So let me try this. It's a wonderful way to frame it because we can make connectionalism so complicated. But at the end of the day, it is how we relate to one another within the Methodist movement. It's how God works through us and between us. And it creates, I don't know that this is going to pass, but it's also about how with God, our wholeness as a body, as a community, is greater than the sum of our individual parts. Does that make sense? So it's not just about the obvious sort of individual people together, but it's about us being the people of God in relationship to God and on a journey with one another and God. So it's this world, and it's structural, and it's about being in small groups and local churches and conferences and then the worldwide church. But it's also about sort of being bound together by God's purpose and seeing something in each other that's that's beyond this world. That's more about what we're doing with the Holy Spirit for Jesus Christ. In and among the world.
One thing I've always loved in the book of Discipline, when it talks about our connection, it describes it as a web of relationships. And that's kind of a helpful image to me, like this huge web that connects and is challenging, right? Because in my small town, in my small church, if I understand myself as a congregation, that's easy in a way, right? Because I'm familiar. But when we think about the reign of God and the influence of Christ and the power of God, the challenge is when you have a web of all different nationalities and races and ethnicities, and it really, to have that kind of relationship is supernatural. You require a supernatural power and connection. The Holy Spirit, without that, so it really bears witness to God in a unique way, more so than a congregational church can. And I'm not saying there's no value to congregationalism, but we choose to be connected in this web of relationships because we think for us in our theology and in Wesleyan theology, it best demonstrates and describes and reflects how God is at work pulling all humanity together. So,
right, and it's kind of like a foil against sort of the individualism that we kind of live with all the time.
Right.
That, you know, even in churches, we tend to lift up a pastor or a couple of people that are kind of the kind of image bearers of the congregation. And for us, we're trying to say that this is no, like, theologically, we understand that the group of people and a web, whether it's at a little church or at the whole connection, are all working together. And really, like, that's, for us, I think, kind of like, I don't know what you would say, Dr. Warner, but kind of like a theological point that if God exists in connection and community, and if love is what binds, God, then that we're kind of like trying to reflect that, it feels like to me.
Right. And Paul's imagery of the body and all of its parts, and all being important, right? I mean, you don't think much of your little finger till you get a splinter, and then you're miserable. And I think the vine and the branches. So there's a lot of imagery of this kind of weaving, intricate but far-reaching, like even the mustard seed, right? You have this little seed, but it grows this huge plant that goes on. So I think there's a lot of biblical imagery to support our connection.
Absolutely. Yes. And it's about that connection participating in God's work in the world. And so that And it's not just exclusively for Methodists, but it's Methodists for the world. And I love that we can be a part of a larger Christian witness.
Yeah, and connection extends to our extension ministers. Those are pastors and clergy who serve in different counseling centers and all throughout communities. It extends ecumenically. We're very involved with other denominations, other faiths, because the work of God and the people of God are not limited, right? So I do think to have a bigger understanding of connection moves us into God-sized dreams rather than just individual dreams.
I feel like that's also like how you end up with two orders of ministry. You know, you have elders and you have deacons, and the elders are doing that work in the church often or in extension ministry of helping sort of send the church out to serve in the world, and you've got deacons who are primarily trying to be connectors, trying to be bridges
Right.
to say that we are not disconnected from the world. That you know, I remember Jim Griffiths, when he was doing like, you know, trainings for churches about how to reach out to their community, he always used this image of a castle sitting in the middle of a lake, you know, and he said, this is how people see your church. You know, they don't know anything about it. And I, you know, I feel like that's how we end up with the way we conceive of our orders of ministry is we've got to have somebody who can be that bridge, and deacons, I think, often fill that very well.
Yeah, yeah.
And then the various boards and agencies, like we say that, and that feels very bureaucratic and structural, and yet it's an extension, an exponential even extension of our participation in God's reign, and I think when done well, a faithful stewarding of resources. So when a local church is faced with apportionments, like, well, the question comes up, well, why? It's like, well, because we're participating as a body of Christ in the world in this connection that's doing so much more. Again, the whole is greater than the sum of the parts in terms of our witness and mission and ministry across the world.
Yeah,
Because we are
and
in
the
connection.
and the scope of that. I mean, I remember having churches step up and send money to a really needy hospital in the Philippines, and they would never have come in contact with that but for our connection, right? That we can pool our resources and do amazing things all over the world because we do that. And you know, I've had a fair number of people say to me, well, I worship God on a mountain by myself. And I'm like, okay, but how much of an impact do you have alone? How much do your resources alone, how much can that change the world? But if you have a connection and we have a common commitment to mission and we pool our resources and we make that a priority, we see change all over the world in some places. And I think my life was markedly changed when I went to a place where the church truly was the only hope for that community, for medical care, for education, and it was the source of life and hope. So once you've seen that, how dare I sit in my privileged little community and not know that there are people dying out there for need of the church. So
So to kind of shift a little bit, I mean, we've been talking a lot about kind of connectionalism as we presently practice it. Maybe, Dr. Warner, could you tell us a little bit about how you understand connectionalism being central to our identity as United Methodists, kind of like from maybe a historical perspective, like how did that become kind of baked into who we are throughout the Wesleyan movement from your perspective?
So my sense of things is that it goes right to the beginning with John and Charles Wesley and the early Methodist movement, that even with the small groups in college settings, and then, you know, extending that into mission settings in Georgia, London, and as the movement grew, that connectionalism was right from the start, that not everyone was in the same small group, but that there were shared practices, there were shared faith commitments that then help to guide the movement. So not to constrain it, but to guide in terms of discernment of faithfulness. And there's while there's different embodiments, like if we were to go to London today, or to Oxford, or to Epworth and see Methodism, it's going to be different. because there are different aspects of how the connection was structured. But because there's a similarity in the shared connectionalism, there's a family resemblance that there's a feeling of home and belonging that's that that permeates across. So right from the very beginning, but it's not a static, concrete, but a more flexible ethos and shared commitments that guides the embodiment. And that okay, so connectionalism, and it wasn't. I want to add one more point, that it's not for itself, right? Like, it's for the world. It's for the blessing of all creation. And so right from the very beginning, it wasn't an afterthought. Oh, well, now we're started, we can do mission. Right from the beginning, love of God and love of neighbor, and the importance of caring for others through education, caring for others through um, uh, visiting the incarcerated and practicing justice, medical care, um, and economic empowerment. So all of those pieces that we can see today in the number of educational institutions, at one point we had, well, I guess we didn't have the most, but we did have the earliest. Anyway, there are things about our history that I could say, we have distinctiveness in education. We have distinctiveness in medical care, a number of hospitals that have been established and that are still in existence, and the ways that we practice economic justice across marginalized communities. That there's that connectionalism from the beginning then continues to guide our ministry in the world.
Right. And I think, too, as we look at apportionment giving, which I hate to be called a tax, apportionment giving is a realization that there's mission all over the world that our church can participate in, and that we give from the earliest days. The early Methodists saw themselves as a gift to the world. And that beyond the borders of my own town, I can give through my apportionment giving and transform lives of people I'll never meet or know, but they're children of God as well. And I think that moves us once again out of it's of, by, and for me, right? It's not a club. This is a gift, and the church is a gift to the world. And, as the nation of Israel was described, a blessing to all peoples. And when we aren't that, I think we lose our identity.
Right. And from a stewardship perspective, you think about how, in early movie, even the story of Captain Foy, where they're trying to build, and they need people to give, and Captain Foy, who's a class leader, essentially says, if I will pledge this many pennies from my group, and if the rest of my class can't fulfill it, then I'll take care of it. And that became a spark for people to be able to do that. But they understood that there was something about that connection that also, right, if fruit of the Spirit is generosity, connectionalism has this real potential to kind of put us in a place of generosity, I feel like. Mm-hmm. But that Captain Foy story is a very early story in the life of Methodism,
Right.
Yeah. The economic piece, and it's not, okay, and that everyone gave of what they had, and there are different kinds of gifts, and because some were able to give of their means, and that our stewardship, and Wesley has such great material on this, John Wesley, about how all that we're given is from God, so, and we're just stewards. And the number of kinds of gifts, so finding people who, and within the society, did not necessarily have standing or resources or occupation, but they did have gifts, and so they shared out of caring for children, or establishing visiting sick, visiting folks. There's all kinds of gifts that then were valued in a similar way, instead of a hierarchy of ways.
Yeah, one of the best, and I might have mentioned this in another one, but I don't remember, so forgive me, it's worth hearing twice. But one of the compelling stories of the early Methodists was their fight against the slave trade in Great Britain, in the Empire. And they were the first ones to call attention to the horrors of the slave trade. But the gifts they used, I mean, the early Clapham Circle, which was one of the early Methodist circles, led by William Wilberforce, who was a member of Parliament, and who was influenced by John Newton, who wrote Amazing Grace about his time as a slave trader. But they were incredibly creative in using gifts, like to let the people know how horrific the slave conditions were on ships. They would have people who'd volunteer to go on these ships. And then they'd come back, and there was a famous engraver who did coins, and some of the most famous coins from that era are the horrible conditions on a slave ship, and they passed these out. So, like early media, they didn't have the internet, so they had to, and then they had Hannah More, who was an actress, which was really not a great thing, but the early Methodists embraced her, so she wrote plays and dramatic things about the slave trade. So they single-handedly educated and helped people see the horror for what it was, and over 20 years worked to end it. And nobody before the early Methodists really cared about enslaved people or what was going on. It just was kind of a fact of life, and how, heck, if I could have somebody work free for me, that was kind of the mentality. And the early Methodists were like, whoa, let's look at and examine the sinfulness of this. So I'm really proud. That's part of our heritage. And the gifts that were used, I mean, they were endlessly creative on how do we tell this story on many different fronts. So
That's a fabulous story, and I've just learned some things which I so appreciate. And those early small groups, particularly in the U.S., to be a member of a class or band meeting, one was not permitted to hold persons, to enslave other persons. Like that's a part of our general rules in the fine print.
And then we departed from it to serve the culture, and that the church always gets in trouble like that, doesn't it? Yeah,
that's right. Yes. And
yeah.
so
Virginia, Powhatan, Virginia is. I started the biography of Francis Asbury, and it starts in Powhatan, Virginia, when he's having all the clergy come from the South and telling them it's okay for their people to have slaves. I think something died in our movement at that point, but how do we accommodate? And so. But I think the bands and the classes were an essential part. I hope we can reclaim that heritage. There's a great figure in Methodism, William Sangster, said the heart of Methodism is 12 men in a fire, in front of a fire. And what he meant was, fires aren't big to me. I grew up in Florida, and any people can be involved. But the heart of Methodism is 12 people sitting around together, talking about their faith, talking about Scripture, and then saying, how are we called to serve people in the name of Christ here? Yeah.
So full disclosure, Dr. Warner, I'm from Powhatan, so that's what Bishop likes to remind me of.
Yeah, well, my husband's been serving there for a couple years,
Yeah,
so I
right.
learned a lot of Powhatan history. Some
true,
is lovely, some not so
That's
much.
right.
So,
That's right.
And Asbury had his gifts, but
that's right.
we all need to be vigilant.
And
right?
I would agree with that assessment. But I appreciate that. So let's talk. We've talked about apportionments. We talked a little bit about kind of the bigger life of the church. One of the other kind of core sort of tenets of that's related to connectionalism, that's a core identity piece for United Methodists, is that itinerancy. So, of course, the bishop and I are at a cabinet meeting right now, so we're
heavily invested in that.
We're heavily invested in that. One of the things I've thought to myself as I've started coming to cabinet meetings is this is actually the test where if you believe in the itinerancy or not. You think it's when you become a pastor who submits to it, but when you're responsible for it, I actually think it may be a bigger experience of do I believe that this is the best way to organize ourselves? So Dr. Warner, you want to talk to us a little bit about how you see connectionalism and itinerancy connected?
Yes, because so with Methodism and United Methodism, we have a number of characteristics, and connectionalism clearly is one of them. The superintendency and itinerancy are another two. And then I think all of it depends upon our participation in God's sanctification of us. And so I mentioned all of those pieces because the role of the superintendency including district superintendents, so bishops, district superintendents within the cabinet, and itineracy within the connection and sanctification. Those are all pieces that work together. I'm trying to figure out if they can work separately.
Not really.
I would defer to you all if they can.
No, when a church decides to be congregational, it really doesn't work well with itineracy.
Right. And so if we're all the congregation, the pastors, the extension of the church through the boards and agencies, through the various bodies, like we're all connected, and then the itineracy, that this is a way of trusting God, of participating in sanctification. So we do have agency, but it's God's work in us, not just individually, but as a body. Like we often sort of stop reading Romans after the personal bits when Jesus does sort of participate in the redemption of all creation, and that's cosmic, systemic, communal. And so to read back through and then into it does, I'm not trying to make itineracy small, because it's not, it features very significantly in our imagination, and it's a part of how we respond to the Holy Spirit. I mean, what a wonderful opportunity and obligation and duty and sacrifice for all of those that participate, you all, and those receiving appointments and the various roles, then to say, okay, I'm not in control. It's not all about my logic. It is about our using the gifts God has given us and participating with that Holy Spirit to then accomplish, to participate in God's mission of the redemption of all. And I think it's beautiful and amazing, and it's scary. So
it's
scary.
terrifying. Yeah.
Yeah.
Well,
But
and the more I think about it, I think, to go back to saying that connectionalism is so different than just my personal congregation, I think the itineracy sees it in the same way. That that I, in my own congregation, in my town, will tend to pick for leadership somebody who looks, thinks, and acts like me. Right? And so the challenge of itineracy is to have a group of people, the cabinet, look at the gifts of the pastors and the churches involved from an overarching standpoint, and saying, this church has been really good at spiritual formation, but they need to move outward more. So what leader can we send who will spur them outward? And vice versa. But it's very helpful to realize, much like parenting, like there's seasons in your child's life where they need something, and then they need to be spurred on in a different way or challenged in a different way. And sometimes that's how the cabinet sees it. And I think about just music teachers I've had in the past. My first piano teacher was very good with elementary age small children, and then I had to move to a teacher who was more complex and really understood the adolescent, and then I would go work with clinicians who were professors, and there was a different skill set that altogether made me a better musician. And our goal is to have churches moving on and flourishing and blossoming, and really also to have the challenge of another, right? The challenge of maybe somebody who isn't quite like me, or somebody from a little different theological perspective, or somebody who's an introvert when I love extroverts. And so I'll close by saying there was a study by the Harvard Business Review, and they said if you want to do the worst hiring, interview, because anybody can anybody can. Well, I'll say that. No, not everybody can nail an interview, but those that can nail an interview may not be the best for your church, and there are some who can't nail an interview who are stellar pastors, right? To have this kind of surface thing. So what the Harvard Business Review said, ideally what you'd have is a group of people who knew all of the positions and knew the people who were eligible for these positions, and they would sit in a conclave and figure out how to assign. And I'm like, ding, ding, ding. But that is so alien
Sure.
to the, you know, to the executives I have in a lot of churches, right? Because I want to make it's about loss of control,
yeah,
right? I
control,
can't
absolutely.
pick.
Yeah.
And I still have churches say, when are you going to send us the list to pick from? Or when are you going to let us interview? And it doesn't work like
Yeah,
that.
I mean, that's, you know, of course, since I'm coming onto the cabinet, I'm moving from my church. Those are the kinds of questions that we you know, so when do we start interviewing people, or when do we, and it's like, okay, that's, no, there's a consultation that happens, but it's not, this is not an interview process, you know, and that there's, and, you know, and you could look back at the pastors, you know, we don't always get it right, but you can look back at most of the pastors of First UMC Salem and say, wow, those are great people
Very different,
yeah,
probably.
they were all very different, you had different gifts and that kind of thing. But generally, with a, you know, a couple of exceptions, those were people who were the right fit because people understood the larger picture, you know. And I think that's true. Yeah.
Yes. And another piece, if I may, is in the midst of this ongoing consultation, which is really all the time, right? We talked about appointment making this morning in Methodism and United Methodist Studies. And I was encouraging students I was like, stay in conversation with your church, thinking about, you know, your various metrics. I'm sorry, I am a data person. So I'm like, how to tell the story and ask lots of questions. Stay in contact with the connection, with your DS, with mentors. Go to everything you can go to in terms of leadership development. Okay, all about the connection. But here's another piece about the itineracy is that as United Methodists, we have been on the forefront, in the lead of recruiting and participating in formation, and then appointing people who might not have been appointed, right? So women, people of color, there's a way in which the participating in the itinerant process has, like you have all have said, has opened us up to all kinds of gifts and possibilities and fruits of sanctification that would, if left to our own devices and just within our own imaginations, without the participation of so many stakeholders, if you will, or so many constituencies, would not be possible. And I appreciate that, you know. Uh, anyway, there are enough stories about difficulties or toxicity around appointments in other denominations that I appreciate that in our denomination there is this, not, I don't want to say system in terms of a clinical way, but there is this organic set of relationships that's not just about the interview, right? It's about knowing and belonging
Well, and it's a beautiful
and
thing. One of my
discerning.
favorite meetings as a DS was with a staff parish committee, and they were in tears begging me the bishop not to move their pastor. And this was a very, very rural church, all white, and they had been sent an older black pastor. And the chair of the committee said to me, you know what, Sue? We thought that y'all were crazy when you did this. We couldn't believe it. We were mortified. We were just, and then she came and she won our hearts, and we hate to see her go. But then they said, but we realize she's really good and is ready for the next level, you know, and we want to send her off to another church and to do well. And so what was amazing was the next pastor that we sent there was a Hispanic woman with a very thick accent who they loved equally. And so you see when it breaks it open, and when you see God at work in situations. Now, that's not to say it doesn't go horribly wrong sometimes, and that, you know, we're still sinful people and we do bad things, but there are glimpses of redemption in the itinerancy that we've seen. So it's beautiful when you see Christ break through all the barriers.
So one thing we haven't touched on yet that we probably would be good is one of the other ways that we talk about kind of our identity and our connectionalism is related to what Wesley called the Model D, but we call the trust clause. And so, Dr. Warner, could you give us kind of a little bit of the background of that understanding, and even, you know, it does extend beyond Methodism, and so just kind of what does that mean, what does that look like, and what are the benefits of that?
Absolutely. Okay, so the trust clause is an aspect of Methodism right from the beginning. John Wesley employed the trust clause so that any local church building, he would have called them chapels at the time, was held in trust by the conference. And we've had some, there's been some developments over time. His priority was that through the model deed, that this was a way of maintaining consistency of doctrinal standards. So the pastors who were admitted into membership in the conference and then participated in the connection and the itineracy, then to preach in the chapels that were held in trust by the conference. And this would, create a a system or an organic set of relationships and accountability. So trust clause goes back to the earliest days of Methodism. It continues in our current embodiments where all of the congregations, all the church buildings, all the facilities are held in trust for the annual conference. The annual conference is our basic organizational unit, not the local church. It's the annual conference where we all come together and then are sent back out. What is, I think, helpful? Oh, I think it's helpful to understand that this is about mission. It's about our purpose, our ministry, that we're whether we want Matthew 28 or love of God and neighbor. This is about our being a part of the connection and not solo agents, right? Like not on our own, but we are held in connection and accountability and belonging, so that we're participating in that sanctification that God is working out through us, through our gifts and our agency, but with a larger imagination, with a larger sense of things. And while it is distinctive that United Methodists have this dynamic of a trust clause and connection to the conference, we're not alone. So a lot of times we think John Wesley was so creative and thought things up out of whole cloth. And mostly he was a really good steward or application. Like he could apply things and restructure them for good purpose. So we're not alone in this.
When I was a kid, I used to be so proud of our United Methodist Church because all the Baptist churches would split, right? Over everything, right? And one sermon they didn't like, they'd split. And so the majority would keep the building and the others would have to leave. And I thought, well, boy, we Methodists never split. We're just good. But I think it's because the trust clause, if every building, and I've always loved the Native American notion that you do things for the next 7 generations. And so we have these buildings held in trust. It's going to be 7 generations from now, a United Methodist Church, a United Methodist outpost for mission, and not built by a certain few people, and it's not ours because we built it. It's ours. It's for the benefit of all. It's the United Methodist outpost in the community, and so I am grateful that you think how many like huge issues about divorce in the life of the church, huge issues about predestination. I mean, things we don't even think about now that they argued about. They killed people over. Mm-hmm. And I think it insulates the church from just the basic argument of the day. It seems like every era has a new argument. But if the church building is held in trust, it stays the United Methodist Church forever. And I hate the whole disfiliation thing. I think we went in the wrong direction. If you disagree with the United Methodist Church, you are free to leave, but the building stays for the benefit of 7 generations from now, who might look back and say, that was a stupid argument y'all had that long ago. But I think that there's a real importance to understand that we build these buildings as a gift for decades, centuries to come. And that there's more to us, and also it keeps, you preach one bad sermon or one sermon that your congregation disagrees with, they can't kick you out and then, take the building and leave. So it was very pragmatic from Wesley's part, and I think it was much more a long-term, how can we make our church a long-term gift to a community rather than just an outpost for particular people at a particular time with a particular opinion. So
we probably have time maybe for one more question. So we've talked historically, we've talked kind of big picture. Bishop Sue and Dr. Warner, maybe if each of you would be willing to give just an example of where you've seen connectionalism at its best.
I'll start. The last church we served, we really embraced every church in our area. We worked together. We came together. I think that's ideally how Wesley would have seen connectionalism. And we discern mission together. We worked together. And our church was the high steeple church and had a very large ministry for unsheltered people and did a lot of that. But then we had another church who was a recovery church, and they really focused on folks in recovery. And then we had another church that really focused on children. They had a premier preschool, and they had excellent children's programs. They were a neighborhood church. Then we had a Latino church, and so it really, we worked as one connectional unit for the benefit of the whole community. And I think for me that was an eye-opening experience as to how, and then we would serve foreign missions and others together. Like we all worked together for a mission in Zambia, and we all worked together for a mission in the Dominican Republic. But I think that going forward, I think that to me was the best representation of connectionalism on a global and a local level that I've seen, and I would recommend it to all churches and all communities.
Lovely example. The example that keeps coming to mind, and I was trying to sort of discern, is this helpful at this point to share? But I think, I'm hoping that you'll hear this. It's the organization of churches in the midst of natural disaster, both with it, like on site, in the zone, as well as beyond, and how we function in the communities, and then as a connection to then serve into those communities. I mean, the energy, the responsiveness, right? And it is about, I do think UMCOR is amazing, and how our general boards serve. So it is about United Methodist Commission on Relief being, first in and last out, and in communities that aren't primarily or predominantly United Methodist. I had experience in a rural Texas area that was mostly Catholic and Baptist, and we showed up, and at the little, I mean, modest, but deeply warm, connected local church, this tiny little church. And they said, we remember people showed up to help us. The United Methodists showed up to help us. So that was among the United Methodists. But then in another, out in the community, Gaston attended, I think, the Ministry Alliance, and we tried to go to everything. When you're in a little town, you go to everything, all the fundraisers and all the festivities. And that's what people would say. They say, "Oh, you're Methodist. Oh, we remember." And it was like 10 years ago that people showed up to help them in the midst of it wasn't a natural disaster, but in a very difficult situation where there was an explosion and many fatalities. So the way that United Methodists respond in connection with itself and with communities and with places all over the world, I think is really beautiful. And that's one example. And then I meant to mention earlier the opportunity we have with regionalization. Like, we're about to embody our connectionalism in even more faithful ways. So there's so many examples, and I'm grateful for that.
Dr. Warner, we want to thank you
Yes.
for your time with us and for sharing so many good insights with us. Bishop Sue, thank you for being here as well, and for being part of our conversation. So, Dr. Warner, we are grateful again for your time, and look forward to talking to you again sometime soon.
And grateful to be in the connection with you.
That's
Yay!
right, yes.
Me too. Thank you so much. Thank you both.